and you should just proceed.
Okay. So this slide shows 6 hypothetical systems, very cleverly called A, B, C, D, and F. Each of these power systems, we ran through a reliability model when I was at NREL, and we set it up so that each of these achieves a 1 day in 10 loss of load expectation. So that's kind of the magic number, right? But it turns out that we did this on purpose to illustrate the point that if you have units that have higher forced outage rates, and I'll come back to that in a minute, you get a different planning reserve margin. So basically the bottom line is each one of these systems is identically reliable 1 day in 10 years. However, they each have different planning reserve margins. So system A has a planning reserve margin of 14.6%. So its installed capacity exceeds its peak by 14.5%. And you can look at the other ones. The worst case here, F, has a planning reserve margin of 29.7%. And so the real takeaway here, you don't need to worry about all the math, but the real takeaway is that we have 6 systems which achieve the same long-term reliability, but they have very different planning reserve margins. And so the takeaway here is, if you're talking to somebody and they say, oh, well, we achieved our 15% planning reserve margin, that doesn't tell you really anything about how reliable they are in the long term. And so that's really kind of the takeaway for this. Let's see if I can figure out how to advance. There we go. I apologize here, but I want to at least run through some of this vocabulary, and you can come back to it after the webinar, and it might make a little more sense. Loss of load probability is the probability that we have a loss of load event. Probabilities are always between 0 and 1. Loss of load expectation, we measure sometimes in days per year, hours per year, something like that. LOLP and LOLE generally don't care how much energy you lose. They generally don't care how long the loss of load event is. Expected unserved energy, EUE, does care that it essentially is a calculation of the amount of energy that you lose. We have other related metrics, like one that counts the number of events, loss of load events. And I think this is a good time for us to start thinking about potentially new metrics. Here's a couple I've suggested. Expected unserved energy divided by the loss of load events. And so we could then calculate the average energy that's lost per event, and so forth. So the other point I want to make here is that from a resource adequacy point of view, the kinds of outages that we care about are the ones that occur because we didn't build enough stuff. We don't have enough, iron in the ground, whether that iron is wind turbines or solar or gas or whatever it might be. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. It's just proving that LOLP has been around since the 1940s. 1 day in 10 is not really a magic number. Nobody knows where it came from. We think it came from this paper by Marsh back in the early 70s, but we don't really know that. The guy running around in the 1940s that started some of this stuff decided that 1 day in 50 years would be a nice number to use for reliability. We use 1 in 10, but in fact, most power system folks, when they do these analyses, don't have enough data to really do, to even calculate 1 day in 10. So they end up calculating 0.1 day per year, which we'll see is not the same. So here are a few technology hiccups, or terminology hiccups, I should say. Installed capacity, we're all pretty familiar with. I've got a 100 megawatt gas turbine. It's rated at 100 megawatts maximum. That's its capacity. There's another term called UCAP, unforced capacity, and we can calculate that by taking the forced outage, 1 minus the forced outage rate, and multiply that by the plant capacity. So my 100 megawatt gas turbine gets a UCAP of 90 megawatts. So in a sense, I can count on that 90 megawatts, not every hour, but sort of on average, that's what it can deliver if I account for the forced outages. We're going to talk about ELCC. I'm sure you've all heard of it. in a couple of minutes. ELCC is measured in UCAP units. In other words, it accounts for outages. Planning reserve margin is usually calculated in terms of ICAP, installed capacity. What you'll see, and I'll be curious if, as you go forward and get involved in more of these proceedings, how many of you run into a situation where a utility says, well, I've got, we calculated an ELCC or capacity value for wind of, say, 20%, and then they add that 20% to the installed capacity of the other units and say, well, here's my planning reserve margin. That's definitely mixing apples and oranges. So it's something to watch for if you're out running around. And down at the bottom here is a sort of a cartoon timeline here. And the objective here is to show that the top timeline shows one event in 10 years. In other words, an LOLE of 1 day in 10. You got one event, and this particular one happens somewhere in the middle of year 5. Doesn't have to happen in that year. Down at the bottom, you have another timeline, 10 years, which shows a 1/10 of an event every year, which corresponds to 0.1 days per year. Now, I don't know exactly how I would define 1/10 of an event, but what we're saying here in the 0.1 days per year is that we're getting one small event every single year versus the 1 day in 10, we only get one event per year. And so there's nothing wrong with using 0.1 days per year, but recognize that that's a very different reliability criteria as compared to 1 day in 10 years. And just a little bit more fun with timelines. You know, if you truly had 1 day in 10 loss of load expectation, then you would expect that over a 100-year period, you'd have 10 outages. Now, they wouldn't all happen, you know, once per decade. I just made these up. You see some clustered around year 15 through 40, and 60 and 70, and then 90 and 100 and 80. So suppose I'm a power system modeler and I come out in year 40 and I start doing my 10-year analysis and I say, I couldn't find any loss of load expectation at all. I went 15 years and I'm still good. So I've got 0 days in 15 years for my system. On the other hand, some other power system modeler comes along in year 60 and finds 3 events and then would therefore conclude I've got 3 days in 10 outage. And so I put this in just to kind of stretch our brains a little to think about long-term reliability. This is really long-term reliability, and the fact that we have a lot of statistical sampling going on. We have a lot of stochastic things going on underneath all of this stuff, whether it's variation in demand or wind or solar or other factors as well. We're thinking and have been thinking about La Nina events, El Nino events. How do they have an impact on wind and solar and demand? There are other jet stream anomalies that we see periodically. I'll come back to that a little bit later. And what's the impact of climate change on wind speed and solar insolation? So lots of questions here. This whole notion of infrequent events, we can then extend that to what about infrequent events that have big consequences? And that sort of leads us into something I don't really want to talk about, but people tend to call it resilience. How resilient is my system to these big events, to polar vortex storms that cause the coal piles to freeze and the gas lines not to work? And so those are sort of loss of load expectation on steroids, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. I'll pause there if there are any questions, and then we'll get into the fun stuff, the math. Any questions before we move on?
Yeah, this is Fred, just relaying a question from Nicole. Why do so many utilities rely on the planning reserve margin if it's so outdated and doesn't account for the capacity value of VERS?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. I don't know. I mean, it's something that's familiar to people. It's been around forever. Does it convey any useful information? I would argue no, it doesn't. But I think it's perhaps institutional inertia. People have done it this way and are used to thinking of it this way, and so continue to do it that way. But I've been pushing for 15 years that people ought to get rid of that. Planning reserve margin to me is an outdated and irrelevant metric.
So, Michael, this is Arthur, and I'm thank you for saying that. I've been curious. To me, resource adequacy has always been a proxy for reliability anyway, and PRM and even the counting rules that lead up to PRM are also just proxies for what we really want to have happen on the grid in terms of reliability. So the question, I guess, is what are the better proxies that we could offer in a VERS clean energy universe that would be a closer proxy to reliability than PRM and the counting rules that lead up to it?
Well, I think that's really what the subject of this webinar today, and I think loss of load probability, it describes not only a particular metric, but it describes a kind of a framework in which you do the analysis. And actually, if I could ask you to hold that question, and I hope we'll answer it as we move forward through this presentation. But if I don't, please raise it again.
Yes, Jim Lazar, I just want to pose a quick question here and not expect an answer now, and maybe we'll get an answer later or in a subsequent webinar. And that is, how do we do trade-offs between the investment necessary to maintain generation or power supply resource adequacy and those necessary to maintain distribution reliability? Either one, a loss of either one causes a customer to be without power. And we in RAP have been talking a lot about how to try to balance those so that we're spending each $1,000 in a manner that improves the customer's reliability the most.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm actually glad you raised that, because all of the stuff that I'm talking about here today has nothing to do with the distribution system. And yet, if you look at outages, most of them are caused by distribution problems, whether it's too much rain or snow, or a line coming down, or a tree coming down on a line. I would argue that we rarely, if ever, have a loss of load event that's caused by not building enough resource. You could maybe argue that if you look at the polar vortex, but we rarely have outages, if ever, resulting from insufficient resource additions. And part of the reason for that is that in most of the LOLE calculations, we ignore the impact of my transmission connection to the neighbors. And that always helps when you have a problem. But I think the issue of how the distribution system and the transmission system play together, and what does that mean in terms of reliability, I think a lot of really big questions, and I don't think we have answers to all of them.
One clarification, please, if I may. This is Lorenzo. A moment ago, you mentioned resilience, and I'm just wondering, how do you distinguish between resilience and reliability?
I don't have a clean way of doing that. They're related. They're not the same thing, and I'm not exactly sure where one bleeds into the other. But I don't think we have exactly a common resilience definition. But in a sense, if you go back to my 100-year timeline, if I've got a resilient system, then I can get through all of this. And so maybe there's a polar vortex in year 60, and then there's a hot spell that sits over the western U.S. with no clouds for a month in year 90. So I mean, in a sense, the resilience is longer term, but I'm not sure there's a clean answer to that question. Let me go ahead and move on, and let's look at calculation. And I hope I'm not taking you too much into the weeds on this, but this is something that's coming up. I know in MISO, Natalie, we've been working with some of this stuff that MISO is doing. There's two big calculation methods. One of them is called convolution, and it's fast. It gives you kind of an average or a mean risk assessment. And it's not really a simulation per se, but it's like a single case. And I'll talk more about convolution in a minute. Monte Carlo is a lot slower. You could have a convolution that maybe runs in minutes and Monte Carlo that runs in days, literally. It does a lot of simulations. It provides a better risk assessment and can explore the corners. What do I mean by that? If there's always a possibility, low probability, that multiple plants will go out at the same time. You never will see that with convolution, because convolution is going to say, well, my 100 megawatt gas plant is effectively 90 megawatts if you count for its average forced outage rate. So with convolution, you never really see multiple outages at the same time. What you're kind of seeing is all units are on sort of a standard forced outage type of situation. So Monte Carlo does a really good job of that, but it takes a very long time to run. So to sort of think about how these two work, imagine I've got a fair coin, a penny, and we know that the probability of flipping the coin and getting ahead is 0.5 and tail is also 0.5. So I could calculate the expected number of heads that I would get after 100 coin tosses or even 1,000 coin tosses. And all I would do is take the probability of getting ahead and multiplying that by the number of tosses. And so if I toss it 100 times, I'd expect 50 heads. Likewise, I'd expect 50 tails. And that's kind of what the convolution approach does with the power system. It's a little more complicated, but because you've got multiple units and you got to figure out, what the forced outage rate of each of the units is, but it comes up with a similar kind of a calculation. And this is an example. I'm not going to drag you through it, but this little table that you see is what we call the capacity outage probability table. And we basically take each unit and fold it into the table, and we get this table that shows the probability, lots of load probabilities, the cumulative probability on the right-hand side. And I don't want to go through all the details, but once you've developed this table, you can calculate the annual LOLE by taking your load or your net load every hour, looking it up in this table, and keeping track of your results. So it's very, very fast. It does a pretty good job. Monte Carlo is fundamentally different. So again, I have a fair coin, but if I'm going to do Monte Carlo analysis and I want to find out how many heads would I get in 100 tosses, I would actually have to go out and flip the coin 100 times and write down each time I get a head. Now, you can imagine if I really did that, after 100 tosses, maybe I got 54 heads. And then I do it again, and maybe I got 43 heads. And so with Monte Carlo, I may not exactly get the same answers I did with convolution, but I can explore these odd combinations of things that might lead me down the rabbit trail into some reliability issue. And so when we do Monte Carlo for the power system, we're basically rolling the dice or flipping a coin, whatever, every hour for every generator. We might also do it for every key transmission line. And so it's possible that we could simulate outages of multiple units, multiple transmission lines at the same time. Those would be they'd be low probability events, most likely, but they might happen, and convolution won't ever see these. Here's an example from some recent work that MISO has done. The answer isn't as critical as it is that when you take a look and you see that they ran somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 different simulations before this converged to a reasonable answer. You can also see in the MISO case that the convolution approach and the sequential Monte Carlo came out pretty close, 14% capacity value. I think this is for wind as compared to 13.95%. But in the sequential Monte Carlo, you get a lot of potentially different outcomes. One of the key
Michael,
things,
can I just ask a quick question
Sure.
on the MISO example?
Yep.
in that, are they looking at different weather years or any other kinds of variabilities?
You can. I don't recall in this particular case. It becomes a question of what are the things that you're simulating, and I believe in this particular case, MISO was looking more at forced outage rates and not so much on long-term weather. But I would certainly argue that if you're going to do this kind of stuff, you would really want to look at long-term weather, and the weather, of course, drives demand, and it drives wind, and it drives solar, and it drives hydro. So, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But I don't think this includes all of that, Priya.
Okay, thank you.
One of the things that's coming up a lot is, people saying, well, my high loss of load probability may not occur during my peak load. And that's generally true. This graph on the upper right is, I think it's an old graph from California. And what it shows, where the red bar is, there's a bunch of peaky periods of time, but they're not all clustered in 1 week or even 1 month. They're spread out from June through September, even a little bit into, well, I guess September in this case. So yes, when your load is high, that's usually when you get high loss of load probability, but there are a lot of other things that are going on. And I know MISO in particular is interested in what happens if they've got a bunch of generation that is taken out of service for scheduled maintenance. And if that happens at a time that it increases their risk. I can tell you some work that I was involved with in California a number of years ago. What we found was that the highest LOLP was in July, which is when the peak was for this particular year, but it was a long hot summer. By the end of September, there wasn't much hydro runoff anymore. And October 1st, a whole bunch of resources decided to go out on scheduled maintenance. And so and it was hot. So what you had in early October was unusual hot weather, no hydro, or not very much hydro, and a whole bunch of generation that was withdrawn from the supply to go out on scheduled maintenance. As a result of all that, what we saw was loss of load probabilities were really high in October. They weren't as high as they were in the peak. But all of the things here on this list, and I won't read through all of them, but you have a lot of things that happen on the system, like maintenance, like scheduling transactions in or out of your system. And a lot of things are going to have an impact on when your risk occurs.
Historically, in the Northwest, our highest loss of load probabilities were in the spring of a wet year, because in a wet year, the reservoirs have to be drafted for flood control rule curves. And if you get a sudden cold snap when your reservoir heads are low, you don't have much capacity in the dams. That's a time when load is not particularly high, or not very high at all. But if you can, following a different set of reliability principles, that is flood control rule curves, you can get into a different kind of pickle, entirely unrelated to load.
Right, that's a great example, and the danger of those kinds of issues is that when if you're focusing totally on your system peak, then you're not watching for some of these other times of risk. I won't drag you through this next slide, but this shows that if you account for hydro and interchange, in this case coming in and out of California, all of these curves would be nice smooth lines if load was the only driver to LOLP. And because you see all these zigzag lines, the availability of hydro, the availability of other interchange either coming into your system or scheduled sales out of your system can have a really big impact on LOLP and therefore on ELCC of your system. So we think that it's past time to do these really critical analyses. Use all hours of the year. Now, I want to stop on that one for a second, because I've seen a number of utilities that still do this today. They say, I'm going to do a loss of load probability analysis. My peak period is usually in the middle of July, so I'll take 2 weeks and I'll run all my LOLE analysis on that 2-week period because it runs fast and I can get more accomplished. That's exactly the wrong thing to do because it's going to totally miss, the impact of all these things we've been talking about, hydro and maintenance schedules and everything else. We've done a lot of work over the whole idea that weather is the driver for demand. It drives wind, it drives solar, it drives hydro. So there's, I think, general consensus that I should use hourly data from the same year for my wind, my solar, my hydro, my demand. If you're looking for times of loss of load risk, don't assume everything is during the peak, and you're going to get most months, most weeks, most days with a loss of load probability of 0. But prepared to be surprised. I mean, that's why you run the model to find these things, and you may not know in advance when they're going to be. I need to step up the pace here a little bit, or we're going to be on the phone till 7 o'clock tonight. But so the idea of how individual resources contribute, we typically measure using effective load carrying capability. Some folks have the mistaken notion that ELCC should only be done on wind and solar. ELCC can be done on any resource, and that's actually where it got started back in the 1960s when Len Garver, then at General Electric, was doing this sort of stuff for thermal units. But basically, the idea is that we have a reliability curve. So this it's kind of a blue curve goes through the circle point 1. I don't know if you can see my mouse right up here. We have a curve here that shows how much load I can serve and what reliability goes along with each of those loads. Now at this point 1, the reliability curve for the system, the blue line, intersects my 0.1 per year reliability requirement. That's the solid red line. So if that's where I'm starting from, and if I add a new resource, then that whole curve shifts to the right, and that puts me on this dotted curve. And the dotted curve, we can kind of trace through this, but what I really care about is 0.4. What is the horizontal distance between 0.1 and 0.4? That distance measured in megawatts tells me the capacity value in megawatts of the unit or units that I've just added. So in this particular case, if I look at the increase in demand I can serve, sticking at my 0.1 day per 10 year, I can serve an additional 400 megawatts of load. Now, that could have been a coal unit that I added. It could have been 1,000 megawatts of wind. The math works in more or less the same way, but this is sort of emerging as the way to calculate the capacity contribution of wind and solar, but it really ought to be used for the capacity contribution of anything, because the method doesn't really care what sort of generator you're looking at. Let me stop and see if there are any quick questions on the CLCC graph.
There is a question in the chat that says, what are the kinds of scenarios or conditions at which convolution may not be a sufficient approach? Is convolution more suited for analysis of conventional generation related events?
One of the shortcomings that I see with convolution is that, well, there's 2 of them, but one of them is that convolution assumes that having a forced outage rate on one unit is totally independent from forced outage on another unit. And so in that sense, it cannot capture things like a common mode failure, the kind of thing you might get with, you got 6 generators hanging off the same natural gas line. Convolution won't let you do that unless you do some really fancy footwork kind of behind the scenes and figure out how you can model that. But Monte Carlo can capture that. And usually with Monte Carlo, you just say, hey, go roll the dice. And so it's possible that you do get units that are out at the same time. There are also other tricks you can play with forced outage rates themselves. There's evidence that forced outage rates go up after a unit has been run for day after day after day at full output and the weather's really hot. It's more likely that you're going to get some mechanical malfunction. And so you can also change the forced outage rates from day to day, week to week, month to month, assuming you have the data. And the convolution can do that, but convolution, I think you're right, was kind of designed for conventional units. I think it does work pretty well for wind and solar. And my own preference is if I want to run a lot of cases as some sort of screening or something like that, use convolution. But if I really want to get into the details of what may happen, I'd want to look at Monte Carlo.
Hey, Michael, on this chart you're showing here, this seems easy to me to follow if this is either kind of a generator that's running all the time on the peak hours, a conventional resource that's like a combined cycle or coal plant, or if it's wind or solar because it's driven by the weather data. So the exact pattern of production, how it lined up with the load, right? But what if this is a more flexible resource or more of a peaker type resource? What sort of emulation do you have to have in there about how that resource is being used in order to get back to 0.4, your 0.4 on the chart here in terms of the megawatt? Because it depends on how you're using the flexibility or the capability of the resource, right? And it can be dispatched in different ways.
Right, and it's a good question, Mark. I think there's sort of two approaches that you can use for that. And one is that, there are many resources, basically all resources get committed and dispatched based on the economics, subject to the reliability constraint. And so if you have something like a flexible unit that you're going to call on it periodically, or something like a battery, which is presumably going to be dispatched really based on the economics. You charge it when prices are low, and you discharge it when prices are high. But so you can run this stuff through an economic dispatch model to get an idea of when things are going to be turned on and turned off, and then sort of freeze that and run it through the LOLE model. The other thing that you can do, and we've actually done this for years with things like pumped storage hydro, is that you can do what I call a reliability dispatch. Now, it's not a dispatch in the usual sense, but where we say, okay, I've got this pumped storage, or it could be a battery. When am I going to use it? And you can do some sort of like a peak shaving or peak leveling algorithm. And if you've got a lot of wind and solar, you might want to do that based on your net demand, not on your just demand, to get an idea of, like, if I'm going to be dispatching on a reliability basis, that gets me pretty close. But I think at the end of the day, you're never going to know exactly how the system is going to be dispatched when you do the ELCC analysis. But you can do a couple of scenarios, like I said, a reliability-based dispatch and an economic dispatch, and maybe do some other scenarios around some of that to get a sense of how some of these resources are going to be dispatched. And in the case of a flexibility resource, you're absolutely going to be using it differently as a flexible resource. But from ELCC, the question is, can I turn it on if I need it? And presumably, if it's not already on, and if it's already on, it's still going to get credit. So I think this would capture that, but we need to be kind of cognizant of what sort of underlying dispatch we're assuming, and communicate that in publications or whatever.
Right. So if storage or hybrid or something was actually being used more for ancillary services, reliability services, than for arbitrage, then you would have to emulate that through your reliability dispatch approach.
You could do it that way, yes.
So I just get worried that everybody's modeling storage, for example, as if it's only doing price arbitrage. And that seems to be the lowest, the low value use of a lot of the flexibility when it comes to reliability issues like this. But another point.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think, you're going to get two answers. And so, if I were looking at a storage device and I'm getting a real different answer from the arbitrage dispatch versus a reliability dispatch, I'd want to look at that a little bit more carefully and see, am I getting the highest value from this resource in that arbitrage, and what's the opportunity cost of saving the battery for a higher risk period of time, and then buying some energy from something that may be a little more expensive than the battery, but in the long term is going to be better off for the system anyway.
Yeah. Michael, this is Rick O'Connell. If I can just weigh in quickly. I spent my Memorial Day holiday reading the Strape ELCC energy storage capacity value on the CAISO system, which I'm sure everyone else did while grilling. And yeah, I mean, they explicitly call out that they, essentially did a reliability dispatch of storage. And so they, program ServM to sort of optimally dispatch storage to essentially give it the highest capacity value. So I think it's really important when you look at these ELCC studies to dig into exactly that question that Mark asked, which is, especially something like storage, pumped hydro, battery storage, like how it's being dispatched can very much change its ELCC value.
Yeah, that's a good point, Rick. And I think kind of at the end of the day, we tend to think of these models as being, if I feed in all the right stuff, it'll give me all the right answers. And there's a tremendous amount of hopefully professional judgment that goes into this. There are many different potential outcomes of the model depending upon small assumptions that you might make. And, face it, at the end of the day, there's a lot of assumptions that get baked into this. And so, as a kind of a maybe former modeling geek, I love to do this stuff, but I think we also have to be careful about taking a single model run and then treating it as some sort of gospel that, yeah, this is the final answer, because there are a lot of things, all these things are connected, and the model is really good about saying, well, you pushed on one thing over here, and so it comes out over there someplace. But there's a lot of assumptions that go into it, and I think the system is getting more complicated, not less complicated. And so I think what that means is we need to do more analysis and more careful analysis to get answers. Because the other thing is, at the end of the day, you get a 20% or whatever wind ELCC capacity value. That's based on the system you have today, and the system you have in 5 years, that same wind may get more, it may get less capacity value.
So this is Fred. Arthur may have a question also about ELCC and solar. Arthur, do you want to ask that one?
Well, I think you may have covered it, at least in part. I mean, there have been concerns in other jurisdictions that ELCC wasn't properly reflecting the reliability value of solar in particular, but I think, as you just mentioned, a lot of it depends on what you see the system looking like and how it changes over time. But and in addition, the hybrid nature of resources, whether you are combining, say, demand response and storage. But do you have any thoughts on whether ELCC is beneficial to recognizing value of VERS or not particularly generous with respect to VERS? Or what is your thoughts about pros and cons of ELC versus other measures?
I think I'm sort of a reliability focused person, so I think that ELCC, and there's a couple of very close metrics to ELCC, equivalent firm capacity and so forth, but to me, something that's based on reliability, like loss of load probability, is the way to go. Now, is it beneficial to wind and solar? I don't know, but I think the bottom line, from my point of view, is that we want to make sure we've got a reliable system, and we also need to make sure that we understand the impacts of each resource on the system, both in terms of dispatch and in terms of resource adequacy. And so I think these are the right methods. As I mentioned, there's a related metric called equivalent firm capacity, which instead of looking at the increase in load you can serve with the new resource, it looks at sort of a perfect resource, and the solar, for example, would be measured against a perfect resource. Or, we've also done work measuring it against a sort of a chosen benchmark resource, like a natural gas unit with a 5% forced outage rate or something like that. But I think at the end of the day, the LOLE types of models is the way to go if we want to understand risk to the power system, and if we want to understand how different types of resources can contribute to that risk. And as I said earlier, a lot of utility folks think that this method is for wind and solar, and other methods are for conventional resources. And I totally disagree with that, because I think this is a framework in which we can measure all this stuff, and we can tease out the impact of any resource or any group of resources. We should be giving ELC to wind and solar and coal and gas and everything else that comes along, as far as I'm concerned.
But
So
how many of them actually use this for conventionals, Michael? I mean, isn't that part of the problem, is they don't?
Yeah, I have yet to see anybody, Mark. But at least folks are using UCAP, which is close. I don't know if it's close enough, but it's okay.
So what happens, if you don't mind my asking, if you use ELCC for wind and solar and you use UCAP or other capacity measures for conventionals? How does that apple approach?
If you're going to assign capacity value or pay for it or something like that, you're using a different ruler for each resource. So ELCC, frankly, ELCC for a thermal unit that has a 10% forced outage rate is likely a higher number. Some of the calculations I've done, if you get, go back to my gas example, 100 megawatt unit, 10% forced outage rate, so its UCAP would be 90%, but its ELCC is probably 91, 92%. Not a big difference, but to me, if you're going to do this stuff, you should be consistent about how you do it. And it doesn't make sense to me to use UCAP for this unit and ELCC for that unit, and who knows what else for some third unit. So to me, we have a solid, rigorous framework for assessing resource adequacy, and therefore for assessing the contribution any resource makes towards resource adequacy. Why not use it and be consistent about it? Okay, I'm about halfway through the slides and about a lot more of my time. So,
Yeah, Michael, if
yeah.
everybody's willing, we can keep the webinar going. We're recording this. So if,
Sure.
unless, and our numbers are holding up here. So I would suggest maybe, another 15 minutes and see how it goes. I don't want to press people too much closer to the end of the hour, but I think we have enough interest here, and I didn't want to interrupt a very important discussion about the LCC here.
Sure, that's fine. And if it works out, if you all want to do a second session at some point, we could talk about that as well. Okay, I'm going to skip over some of this. I think we're all pretty aware of the various relevant characteristics of wind and solar. We ask the conventional resources to behave differently. It's because it's a cost-effective way to behave. We get steeper ramps and lower turndowns from wind. We get steeper ramps from solar. The capacity values are not standard. It depends on your system. It depends on the wind. It depends on the solar. We've seen in the WEC wind varying from roughly 10% to roughly 40% of its capacity for ELCC values, and we've seen solar kind of all over the place, 30 to 80%, give or take. One of the interesting things, I don't know, a number of years ago when we started looking at the solar capacity value in Arizona, and I think a number of us were surprised that it wasn't higher, but it turned out that on those hot, peaky days, you don't get as much solar because there's so much haze in the air. And so there are things like that that you may not expect are going to have an impact, but they do. And my last kind of comment on this particular slide is that we really need to start using multiple years of data. Some folks are doing that, but it's really critical. If we're serious about having a power system that has some large percentage of wind and solar, and if we're serious about maintaining resource adequacy on that kind of a system, we cannot base our analysis on 1 or even 2 years of data because it's just not going to be credible. If we're overbuilding the system, then I guess that's fine. I mean, it means we're paying a lot more for reliability than we perhaps want to pay, but it doesn't make sense to me to just look at 1 or 2 years of data.
Michael, this is Nicole Hughes. I want to ask a question about that. So
Sure.
let's say, for example, in the Northwest Power Pool, they want to use ELCC as the value for all variable generators. When the program is set up, and you're saying we need to be using several years of operating data, they would assuming they would take a broad spectrum across the region of different operating solar plants and wind plants, and then some that also include storage, and come up with some values to be used. Could you then just take, like if new resources were to come online, could you take, forward operating generation curves and just apply those regional metrics or whatever to new resources that come online? Or how do you handle new resources coming online and being able to capture that historic data is kind of where I'm going with this.
Well, that's a hard question. I don't think there's a single correct answer to that, but when you have a new resource and you by definition, you don't have historical data, it creates a challenge because you do want to, actually, you don't care so much about the historical as you do about going forward, that how do you do that? A little bit later, I've got some thoughts. I know that Ben Kahala, I think is his name. I'm not sure if I say that properly, at the Northwest Council, I believe. Now, he was at Bonneville, and he's suggested some ways for using weather data, long-term weather data, to try to estimate wind. I'm not sure if he's applied that to solar. I'm honestly, I'm not sure that methods like that are robust, but there's certainly a lot of interest in trying to figure out ways to create the data sets. One other approach is to, the NREL data set for both wind and solar has got multiple years of data, very high time resolution. Oftentimes that can be utilized and perhaps adjusted somehow for the locale. No single good answer to that question, but I think that's another area that I think needs a lot of work.
Yeah, this is Fred. That's Ben Coela, who's the power planning director there, and John Fazio and John Ollis and others who are working on this area are thinking a lot about that, and also thinking about climate adjustments going forward. And their early results are showing some fairly startling results. But I think that the idea of both historical and forward-looking data assessment is, I really agree with what you're saying about that.
Yeah, I'm glad they're working on this stuff, and I think it's going to be we don't want the perfect to get in the way of the good. We need to move forward on this stuff, and I think it's critically important. I'm going to kind of skip through this next slide. It just shows, it proves that we did some work looking at alternative metrics, LOLE, LOLH, expected unserved energy. There are some differences, not perhaps as much as we had thought. This graph, or this slide, has two graphs. On the left, from some work we did in California, and you can see this is a long time ago, 2002 through 4. Looking at the ELCC of wind in California, you can see some not huge changes, but one in particular, the San Gorgonio wind was very, very different in 2002 as compared to the other years. And then some Minnesota wind integration study from roughly the same period of time, I think it was done maybe 2006, using 3 prior years of data. And you can see there's a really big difference in the capacity value of wind year to year. And this is kind of the point, because you can imagine if you said, well, I've done my ELCC of wind and I'm getting 20%, and then you build everything and then you move along, and then all of a sudden you go from a 2003 wind regime to a 2004 wind regime, or worse yet, to 2005, and you end up with 5% as opposed to 20%. And so how are you going to build your system in such a way that it's robust against that kind of drop in capacity value, the interannual variation? One thing you'll hear utilities say is, yeah, but such and such a year, I wasn't getting very much wind or solar during my peak period, and so I should give it 0. And the same logic then would apply to a coal unit or a gas unit. We actually had a coal unit here in eastern Colorado a number of years ago, probably 15 years ago, that blew a boiler tube right, I think it was early June, right before the peak period. It was a big plant. It was out of service until end of August, early September. And so its capacity contribution for that season was essentially 0. Would I want to give it a capacity value of 0 going forward? Of course not. But that's why we have LOLE calculations. We want the system to be robust enough that if we have a problem or a couple of problems, we can survive without that plant or without those plants. Coming back to the data requirements, and I think we've already talked about this, but about the last thing you'd want in your model is to have a particular day that you're modeling where the demand came from a hot sunny day when the air conditioners are cranked up like crazy, and your wind data came from a different year, but on that date happened to be cool, cloudy, windy, rainy, everything else. So it's really critical that the data sets are consistent with each other. We've argued for a long time that if you're doing historical analysis, then get historical data. The hydro folks are great. I mean, there's, what is it, 70 years or something of hydro data. We need to build up our wind and solar data sets to be similar to the extent they can be. I'm going to skip over a couple of slides here. But getting back to this multi-year variability, this is Sweden. Sweden doesn't have a huge amount of load growth, but this shows some real variation in the peak demand over the, it's about a 20-year period. And so peak demand varies, and certainly we've got that happening this year. The question is, how many years of wind and solar and demand data do I need to get a stable outcome? And the answer is starting to emerge to maybe 7 or 8 years. You won't get a complete convergence. This is some work from Finland. There's some work from Ireland that comes up with something similar. Not a hard and fast rule, but I think the point is more is generally better. So as we move forward with these kinds of analysis, I would certainly strive for getting a good solid 7-8 year data set if I possibly could. Weather has a big impact. There's no surprise, but these little miniature bar graphs you see at the bottom are even older. We did some work trying to, this was back when Minnesota was building 400 megawatts of wind on Buffalo Ridge. And so we had a project, Roy Artig, who was at the Department of Commerce at the time. Where would we put these to maximize reliability in the sense of LOLE? And without dragging you through the gory details, the locations in the left-hand bar graph are extremely different than the locations in the right-hand bar graph. And what happened in, what was that, 1997, maybe it was 96, one of those 2 years, I can't remember which one. During the winter, the jet stream split, and half of it went north over Minnesota, the northern edge of Minnesota, and the other half went south of Minnesota. And in that gap between the split and the jet stream, there wasn't any wind. And so a number of sites had absolutely lousy wind. And you want to be prepared for that. You don't want to be surprised at that. So I think these weather impacts are really critical to understand. I'm going to skip through this as an EPRI report. You can look this up later. This is similar to some of the work that Ben was doing in the Northwest. I think it's promising. I think there's more validation that needs to be done on this kind of stuff, but I think it's really important to start doing more with interannual variabilities. Any quick questions before we move on? Okay. I think we all have a pretty good sense of what's changing. We're looking at high renewable energy penetrations, demand response, or perhaps better called dispatchable demand and storage, electric vehicles. I don't know if Dave Olson's still on the phone. Dave, I got this idea from you, this idea of energy first planning, and I think we're really starting to see that across many parts of the country, across the world even, where we're focusing on the clean energy first. And so you can see in this nice triangle, the renewables and dispatchable demand. That's what the state goals are, to build, X% carbon free by 2030 or 2040 or whatever the magic year is. So we're going to do that, and then we have to figure out what the other is going to be. Storage, dispatchable demand, quick start thermal units, fancy pump storage hydro, closed loop hydro. What are they going to be? We don't know. But we're seeing this happening, but I don't think that the importance of risk assessment in the form of LOLP and related analysis, it's never going to go away. And actually, I think it's becoming more important for the reasons we were just talking about. We're seeing big impacts on wind and solar year to year, and when we put more eggs in that basket, more wind, more solar, and perhaps additional climate-induced variability, we need an even better risk assessment. And so that's why I think we need to straighten up our terminology, UCAPs, ICAPs, ELCCs, all of those things. Don't mix and match them. Pick one. Pick a good solid framework like LOLE to do the analysis with. I think I think we can handle modeling the dispatchable demand. There's no single way to do that. We need to do some scenarios around what that might look like. Storage, kind of the same thing. We can model that in a reliability-based dispatch and an economic dispatch. I think the distributed energy resources, I think that's where the challenge is going to come in, because at the moment, we don't have full visibility and control of those from the bulk system. And so we're basically giving the system operator a job saying, you've got to make everything work, but part of the system is going to be invisible to you, and you not only can't see it, you can't control it. It's like driving a car and not being able to use the clutch or something. I don't know. People have talked about varying levels of resource adequacy at different rates. We can't do that at the moment, but the technology that we have would probably enable us to do that if it's cost effective, and I'm not sure if it will be. But I think we have a framework that can allow us to look at all of this stuff. It isn't going to be easy to do. The data sets are going to be critical, as I mentioned, and I think the last 10 or 20% could be difficult to analyze. Just a thought, if we get the electricity to 80% or maybe 90% carbon free, should we just put the electricity system on hold and say, let's go work on transportation or industrial processes or something else? I don't know. I think we've covered some of this before, that, how do you characterize storage? It's got a capacity, it's got an energy limit, state of charge. We've been modeling pumped storage hydro for decades, and we know how to do that. It isn't perfect, but we can go at either the economic modeling or the reliability modeling. I'm going to skip over this, a set of slides from my colleague Debbie. Basically, again, the last 20% can be challenging, and we're not quite sure how to do that. Storage requirements are going to vary depending upon the characteristics of your system and probably the weather that you enjoy. New York has longer peaks, so you're going to need longer storage than Florida, for example. And so when we take a look at the role of storage, it's going to be very much system specific. And of course, there's a lot of developments yet to be made, I think, with storage technologies. Most days and hours have a 0 LOLE, and so if you look at this sample LOLP graph, let me point out that that is a logarithmic scale, and so in effect, you probably have somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 hours, give or take, where you have any significant loss of load probability. Once you get down to 10 to the -8th power, that's a pretty small number and a pretty low risk. So most of the risk is probably distributed around a couple of hundred hours, maybe 300 or 400 hours. And so when you think about what demand response could do, it probably doesn't have to do a lot in order to make a big impact if you can get it to perform during those high-risk times. How responsive is it going to be? How are we going to analyze it? I think more and better Monte Carlo that we can link to the weather. How do we deal with electric vehicles and hot water heaters? And there are a lot of devices that I think are going to be really, we can get a lot out of them. The one thing I definitely want to talk about, and this is a little bit of a change of pace here, but can we assess flexibility using loss of load expectation-based methods? And in case I run out of time, the answer is probably no, or well, maybe. We've seen a number of analyses that say, okay, we've got this nice LOLP framework. It works really well for resource adequacy. How about we start applying that to ramping so that we get some kind of a loss of load probability equivalent for ramping? And so if I can't ramp fast enough to chase the wind or the solar, then that's a problem. And so we've seen this idea of taking the LOLE calculation, but applying them to ramps. And I think we have to be extremely careful with that. I think it's fine to use a metric like that to compare portfolios to see which ones ramp better than others. But the dangerous step is to then turn that into a reliability requirement. And at the same time, say, I need to be able to meet 1 day in 10 ramping. And here's why that's such a bad idea. The graph at the bottom, it's a little bit hard to read, but that's okay. The point in that graph is to show you the actual, what we call area control error, ACE. Every balancing area has some ACE. Area control error means that I don't have perfect balance between my resources and my demand. And ACE is typically calculated every 10 minutes. So you can see for this particular utility, virtually every hour of the year, there is some ACE. And a couple of times you see there's a very large negative ACE, there's a pretty large positive ACE, but every 10-minute period of the year, there's some slop. They're not perfectly meeting their demand. And so, we might be tempted to say, well, that's a bad thing, right? It's not a bad thing at all, because we have rules in place, NERC rules that specify how often can you do that and how far, how big of an ACE could you have. Now, the rules have changed over the last couple of years, and we have something new called balancing authority area limits, BAAL. And the BAAL, there's a graph of it in the upper corner here, right-hand corner. I won't go through the gory details of this, but if frequency on your interconnection is high, too high, that means that if my generation is a little bit low, I'm actually helping system frequency. And for as long as the interconnection frequency is too high, I can continue to drag on the frequency. In other words, my demand is going to be exceeding my supply, not by a lot, but by a little bit. And I could do that in theory indefinitely. In other words, I could be missing a lot of ramps and I'd still be in compliance with the NERC reliability rules. Now, if frequency is high and I'm over generating, that could be a problem. I have a half an hour though before I can return back to a particular limit, and that limit is calculated based on the frequency that occurs at the time. And so when you hear the argument, well, but you might miss a ramp and that's a reliability event, it's a loss of load event, not true, because the ramp that you didn't quite make simply adds to your area control error. Everybody has area control error, and I'm not advocating don't worry about ACE. You do have to worry about ACE, but missing a ramp or missing a couple of dozen ramps is not going to be a reliability problem in 99.9% of the cases. So if you see that, call me or call Rick, and we'll we'll talk you through that. Renewables are flexible. I won't drag you through this chart. You can read about it. There's a link to it. The even better information is this graph, and I know a number of you have probably seen this, but this is from Excel Colorado from maybe 5 years ago or something like that. And this demonstrates how a wind plant can actually provide flexibility. It can provide flexibility through the economic dispatch. And so you see at 2:45 in the morning, the system operator says, I got too much generation online, I got to do something. I can't turn down my coal burners or my gas burners because I'm going to need them in the morning. And if I turn them off now, I don't get them again for another day. So turns down the wind plant, gives it a dispatch instruction, says go down 300 megawatts, and the wind plants respond really fast to these dispatch instructions and accurately. And if you look at that blue line from around 2:45 to 4 o'clock in the morning, roughly, that line is exhibiting better control than probably any thermal unit on the grid. I mean, it is dead on, right at 300 megawatts where it's supposed to be. The operator then decides, because ACE, which you see the yellow line down below, is kind of wandering all over. ACE has gotten to be too low, so the operator says, I need a little bit more generation, so I'm going to put the wind on AGC, automatic generation control. And this is a type of control where every 4 seconds the computer takes a look at the system frequency and then sends a signal to the generators to adjust accordingly. And so first the wind goes up, and then it comes down, and then it goes up again. Every 4 seconds you're getting a signal. And it turns out that it isn't because it's wind necessarily, but wind or solar or anything on an inverter can respond very, very quickly to either a dispatch instruction or to a regulation instruction. So what that means is that I can actually utilize my wind and solar to help get some of the flexibility that I need out of the system. Do I want to pre-curtail my wind as Excel did in this case at 2:30, 2:45 in the morning? Not necessarily, but that's really an economic question, whether I'm better off to reduce the wind or the solar output, or whether I'm better off to reduce the coal or the gas output. But in any case, we have the flexibility of operating the system economically, and I can do all kinds of stuff with wind and solar.
Crank up and superheat some water heaters at those hours also works.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, and this isn't intended to be just about wind and solar, but it's intended to be, you know, we can get a lot of flexibility out of resources, and certainly hot water heaters. You know, eventually, I think electric vehicles will be able to get a lot of services out of them if we have the proper communication and control, and and the owner of the vehicle has the ability of sort of dialing up, here's when I need the car and how long I need it and how much I'm willing to, contribute to the grid. And of course, that depends on how much I get paid. But I think we have a lot of capabilities that we can get a lot of flexibility from the system. So flexibility is certainly important. Be very, very wary about anybody that talks about LOLE flex or LOLP methods applied to flexibility, because it's really easy to run down the rabbit trail and be doing stuff that really is frankly incorrect for in terms of reliability analysis. I just briefly talk about transmission. I said early on that we don't typically see LOLE events in the US that result from inadequate system. And I think the reason that we don't, one of the big reasons that we don't see these events is because we've never included the transmission in a systematic way in our LOLE analysis. And I think the next slide, yes, this next slide is a little bit better, illustrates something similar. So we did this little project 7 or 8 years ago when I was at NRO looking at the West. And we said, okay, let's start with the sub-regional analyses. And so we took the Rocky Mountain Power area at the time and Southwest and all of that. And we said, what if each of these subregions builds out to 1 day in 10 years? How much capacity do they need to build? And we did that analysis and wrote it all down. And then we said, okay, now suppose that there's, we pool into the region. So we got the Northwest, the Southeast, and let's see, Northern Tier Transmission, Columbia Grid, and Southwest. So what happens there? And then we built them out to 1 day in 10. And then we said, okay, the final case, let's assume that the WEC is one giant happy family. We'll hold hands and walk into the sunset. And we plan and operate the system as a single Western system. How much generation do we need? This graph shows the difference. And so if you do a sub-regional aggregation, let's take the high wind, because it's in the middle of the graph. With a sub-regional aggregation, we could save around 25 gigawatts. That should say gigawatts, not megawatts. We could save about 25 gigawatts of generation. We don't have to build 25 gigawatts. In the high mix, lots of wind and lots of solar, in assuming the interconnection is perfectly seamlessly operated with full transmission everywhere, we could avoid building about 60 gigawatts. And again, that is gigawatts, not megawatts. The point is that when you have two neighboring systems and they do their own LOLP analysis and they say, I can't assume my neighbor is going to be available. I'm going to assume they're not available whenever I need them, so I'm going to build my own system separately. And you build out to your 1 day in 10 or whatever your target is. Your neighbor does the same thing. Well, you're going to be overbuilding capacity. The two of you are going to be overbuilding capacity compared to what you could have done if you built transmission between the two and you operated in a coordinated fashion. And you don't have to be fully coordinated. You could be coordinated in the sense of having a reserve sharing agreement. And no two reserve sharing agreements were created equal, so you'd want to look at how it works. But if I have a LOLP event, but my neighbor's got capacity, then I can avoid that LOLP event as long as I've got transmission to bring that capacity in. And I maybe only need it for an hour, 2 hours, or something like that. Or maybe we have backing up the reserve sharing group, we have a backup emergency contract, so that if I need that energy for a day, assuming it's available, I can get it for a day. And this example is just with two systems. What if I have 3 or 4 or 5 interconnected systems? What can I do? And I don't expect we're ever going to get perfect transmission in the West. We're never going to see these kinds of benefits. but we know that they exist, and I think that they need to be at least recognized so that we understand the trade-offs when we're building up the system, or if we're not building transmission. The transmission can help with all kinds of things with respect to markets, with respect to avoiding curtailments of wind and solar, but can also play a critical role in reducing the amount of megawatts that I've got to build and sink into the ground, whether they're wind megawatts or gas megawatts. I can avoid them. And then the last thing I have is, we've got all these great historical analysis. We run LOLP models. It's all wonderful. But now I'm putting together, maybe it's an IRP, integrated resource plan. Maybe it's a transmission plan. How do I characterize the past in a way that is reasonable to predict the future? And this is just a simple example. There's a lot of ways you could do this differently than I did, but this is sort of a hypothetical utility. We're taking a look at expected unserved energy. And so in the first case, up at the top, you see year one. It's kind of a heat map here, and we've got the hours of the day across the top and the months of the year along the side. And so the green periods is when you have zero LOLE or expected unserved energy. The light yellow, there's a slight amount. You can't even see it because of the rounding error. There's a tiny bit of EUE there in hour 6 in April, May, and June. I don't quite know why that happened, but it did. And in year one, in hours 18 and 19 in January, you got a problem. That's probably a combination of peak, but you also could have had some I don't know, that you'd go out on maintenance during those times. But whatever it is, you've got things going on in periods that are not your peak. But in July and August, you can see those solid red periods of time. And so what that tells me is I've got a lot of risk in July, mainly from 1400 to 1920, something like that. I've got some risk in August. I have some in September, but not as much. It's kind of yellow-orange. I do have some in April. This could be sort of the hydro issue we talked about earlier. It could be units that are out on maintenance, anticipating that's a shoulder season, and I've got a little bit more risk as a result of that. But this gives me kind of a nice snapshot of when the risky periods of time are. And then, of course, the second year down at the bottom looks quite different. July is not nearly as red hot. August is hotter, but July's got a longer period of risk from noon till 8 o'clock or something. And you can see a number of differences here in this. Well, hopefully I have more than 2 years. I have 5 or maybe even 10 years of this stuff, and I can put them together. Now, I just did a simple average. There are other and maybe better ways to do it. But year one and year two on the left, and then sort of the average on the right. And you could do maybe some weighted averaging so that you're accounting for risk. There are a lot of things you could do. But the point is that the two individual years are both showing you some periods of risk. They're different periods of risk. Well, some are overlapping, but some are different periods of risk. And I don't want to throw those away when I'm looking at the future. And so if I want to find out when my periods of risk are, I probably want to look at historical stuff. And if I have any new data that would tell me that the future is going to be a little different than the past, I'll take that as well. But I think I've seen utilities just really recently in IRPs do this really detailed analysis. They put together 6 months from one year and 6 months from a different year because they think it represents things better somehow. And then they come up with, these are the exact hours that I got LOLPs. And so when I plan for my future system, I'm going to use those exact hours that I got from my composite year. That wasn't not a composite year in the sense it was an average of several years. It was 2 6-month periods bolted together. And my response to that is, there's probably a zero likelihood that the hours that you've identified from this 6-month bolting on thing is going to have anything to say about your future risk. And so I think we need to this needs a lot of attention. I don't think anybody's really given much thought to how we do this. And so in that right-hand chart, I would want to use that so that I could say, well, you know, when are my risk periods likely to be? They're going to be spread out a little bit more than I thought. In 1 year, they might look differently than the next year, but I want to cover those. And maybe these are times that I want to avoid having resources go out on scheduled maintenance because I've got some risk in those times, and I don't want to risk a loss of load event.
Seems to me that analysts are more likely to use all of the hours in which they had LOLP risk in the past and try and plan for 400 hours instead of 200 hours. And I think one of the things we'll talk about in this committee's future meetings is how to make the system dynamically responsive to circumstances that exist today, not planning for the challenges that we faced yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly right. And you go from maybe 200 hours to 400 or 500 or whatever the number is, because it's hindsight's 2020. You know exactly when your risk was, well, maybe, but going forward it's a tougher problem.
Hey, Michael, it's Fred. How about if we go another 10 minutes here, and if you could have a little bit of time for Q&A too, that will, so we have a few minutes before the end of the hour to get ready for whatever's next. But this is going fine, and we still have pretty much everybody on board.
Great. I don't have anything left except a summary, and then I've got an appendix of about 200 slides, but I think maybe it would be more useful to just kind of open this up to any questions that folks have.
Let me ask one that Priya sent quite a while back after you had talked about the convolution versus the stochastic approach. And let me ask her, I'll just raise her question here. What are the kinds of scenarios or conditions at which convolution may not be a sufficient approach? Is convolution more suited to analysis of conventional generation related events? I think you addressed those, but if you could go back and summarize again on that point.
Fred, this is Priya, and if I can just sort of, because I do recall Michael's earlier answer, and I'm just wondering if I can piggyback to make this question more time relevant now, because one of the uncertainties or variabilities that everybody I'm sure is thinking about is the impact of weather and then the cascading effects. And Michael, in one of your latter slides, you talk about how we have to think about more effective ways of incorporating weather variability. And I think you specifically said into Monte Carlo analysis. So I'm curious how you sort of envision all these different pieces coming together in a way where we have manageable computational complexity for utility planners and others. Is it sort of a vision of coming up with multiple scenarios for incorporating weather variability and still keeping convolution as a tool in the toolkit, or is it really going all out into, crazy statistical sampling? Or I'm just trying to picture how, the best minds in the field like yourself are sort of visualizing this coming together in a manageable way from a computational perspective.
So that's a big question. Manageable is going to be a relative term, because as we start looking at more weather years, however we do that, it's going to increase the complexity of either the convolution or the Monte Carlo. I know that folks have done some of the modeling folks have done work on taking multiple years of data with time sync wind and solar and demand and maybe hydro. Hydro is kind of, sometimes it's included, sometimes it isn't. And then doing a Monte Carlo whereby they say, well, I'm going to roll the dice and I'm going to pick a day from all my Januaries. And so you pick that day, and that day has consistent wind and solar and demand. But because you're selecting each day from this random process, the idea is that you're preserving the wind, solar, demand underlying correlation, and you're doing a stochastic selection process. I think that's interesting. I'm not absolutely convinced that works, because clearly you're going to have potential seam issues every midnight, where you draw a day where it's the middle day of a 3-day storm, and you plop it in your simulation, and then you roll the dice, and instead of getting the next last day of the storm, you get a hot sunny day. And so what happens at midnight? Well, your wind goes from 4,000 megawatts to 0. I mean, I think that there's some issues doing that. I think fundamentally, I like the concept of being able to have some sort of data set like temperature. I get nervous that temperature is the only variable used in some of these cases, but using temperature as sort of a weather proxy, or maybe temperature and pressure or something like that. And from that, do a bunch of regressions to figure out what demand looks like and what wind and solar look like. I get a little nervous with those things because I don't know how you validate them exactly. But I think we need to start doing that stuff, and some people are doing that stuff now. And I think we need to just continually kind of circle back and think about how to improve it. But in terms of can I use convolution with that? Yeah, I can. Convolution is really great because it's so fast. So you could do a lot of scenarios, but you are assuming there's no common mode failure with convolution. At least convolution in the way that we've implemented today. I think you could jazz it up a little bit and have like a sort of a double table of convolution, where you say, a good example is you've got 5 gas plants on the same gas line. Well, the gas line fails, then all those gas plants are out too. And convolution, as we do it now, can't handle that. So maybe we have a combination of Monte Carlo and convolution. The Monte Carlo says, oh, I know these 5 gas units are on the line. Let's roll the dice. And if the line is good, then that's fine. And if the line is out, then all 5 of those units I'm taking them out of the simulation. So I could see some evolution towards that kind of thing, or maybe a dual convolution table to make it fast. But convolution is always going to miss the unusual stuff. And if we do Monte Carlo in a way that we are not assuming things are uncorrelated, and I think most of the time that's what's happening. You roll the dice separately for each thing you're trying to simulate, then you can potentially find some interesting things that happen because all these units are going out at the same time. Is it likely? No, it's very unlikely, but it happens. And that's when we start to kind of get into the kinds of things people think of as resilience, which is, you've got a low probability, high impact event, like the gas line going out. We know that those events have a likelihood that's not 0, it's some small number. And how do we do that? So I'm not sure if I quite answered your question, Priya, but I think both Monte Carlo and convolution have their place. I think, computers keep getting faster. We keep getting our ability to do more complex algorithms is getting better. I could see a lot more computer cycles being spent on this in the future.
A lot of people are installing batteries as part of PV systems today, and in Hawaii, it's about 80% of new systems. And in most cases, those are not visible to the utility, to the grid operator, to the balancing authority. But in a couple they are. Liberty Utilities and Green Mountain Power are participating with their customers in the cost of that storage in exchange for accessing it for grid services. What kinds of tools do we need to get the reliability value of those behind the meter storage devices able to affect the need for conventional generating reserves?
I'm not sure I have a really good answer. I think there are a couple of approaches that we could take, and one of them is is like in the case of an investor-owned utility, like, you know, I'm outside of Denver, so I buy power from Xcel. You know, they are the distribution provider as well as the, you know, my wholesale provider, so to speak. So they would have the sort of the institutional ability somehow to get metering on my stuff, and we could then, maybe they've got a standard PPA of some kind, or they're buying from me or I'm buying from them. I mean, we're buying from each other, and they would have the ability, like you know, cycling air conditioners or turning off the air conditioners during peak. I think that's one model. Another one is having an aggregator that goes out and says, I'm going to collect, you know, 100 or 1,000 solar PV, the PV battery systems, and sell that to the utility. And that probably wouldn't work here in Colorado with Xcel, because Xcel is the designated utility for this region. But if you have got some parts of the country
doing that with Hawaiian Electric.
I'm sorry?
Sunrun is doing that now with Hawaiian Electric. They're aggregating batteries on the systems they've installed and selling grid services to the monopoly generation and distribution provider.
Yeah, it's fair enough. You know, I don't know enough about the sort of the regulatory hurdles to do that, but I think you know, technically there's nothing to prevent that from happening. But I think it depends on, you know, whether it's doable from a regulatory point of view or not, and certainly we could make it doable. But the last 35 slides in my slide deck, and I'm not going to take you through them right now, but you can look at them. Is an example of demand response from a company out east in Bala that compiles a bunch of loads into a regulation service. And I don't know of anybody that's done the kind of analysis like that would apply to PV and batteries, but judging on what Imbala was able to do, and this is an actual example, this is not a hypothetical one, judging at the shaping that they were able to do on that dispatchable demand, I see very few limits on what we could do when we have large penetrations of batteries and PV on the distribution system, and the ability of controlling them, and the ability of making sure that we have the proper incentives in place for the owner of the PV battery system as well as the utility.
So hi everybody, it's Fred. We've reached the time limit here, I think, for everyone. So Michael, I just want to start by saying thanks so much for a fabulous presentation. We knew we couldn't cover everything, but we covered a really large amount of ground, really a solid foundation for our work going forward. So again, thank you very much. If anyone has additional questions, send them to me and I'll relay them to Michael, and we'll definitely be in contact. We'll meet again in 2 weeks. I'll send out a note on that and other issues for this new work group. And unless there's anything for the good of the order, we'll call the session to an end.
Will there be an opportunity at the next meeting to raise these follow-up questions?
Yeah, we'll talk about how to proceed, but I don't know exactly yet what the agenda will be for the next one. So, Michael, do you have anything else to add before we close?
No, thank you very much. I appreciate you all hanging in there with me, and for the good questions. And I hope this has been somewhat helpful. And you know, let me know if you have any follow-up questions.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Michael.
Great.
Thanks, Michael.